Hello, I'm Paul Carroll, technical writer for Digital Photo Magazine, and welcome to part 3 of this month's Digital Darkroom video tutorials. In this final part of the tutorial, we're going to be using the lens blur filter in Photoshop CS3 to add a soft focus effect to our portrait. We're then going to reduce the opacity of our layer just to rein back that blur effect a little bit, but in this more advanced technique we're also going to be using a layer mask and paint into the layer mask using brushes with different opacity strengths to create the illusion of the shallow depth of field effect and really enhance our soft focus portrait. Okay, I'm going to close down this image and then we can get started. Open up the image carla.jpg from off the CD into Photoshop CS3, but unfortunately this more advanced technique is not compatible with Photoshop Elements. Now we're going to be working with layers, so make sure your layers palette is open, and we can open it by going up to the window menu and down to layers. I'm just going to move the position of the palette a little bit and get rid of move my toolbox over there. Okay, so in your layers palette, click on the downward arrow on the right hand side, and from the flyout menu we want to select duplicate layer and just click OK. Now, making sure your background copy layer is highlighted, we want to go up to the filter menu, down to blur and across to lens blur. That will launch the lens blur dialog box, and it's on the right hand side of the dialog box that we've got all of the sliders to control the lens blur. We're going to be using the controls under the iris menu, which control the level of blur which is going to be applied. The options under the shape menu determine the number of blades or how many sides are used when applying the lens blur. We're going to be using octagon, which is the 8-sided shape. The radius slider determines the strength of the blur which is applied, and you can see as I increase the radius slider, the preview image on the left hand side of the dialog box previews how the final effect will look. I think a high radius like that of 77 is going to be far too much. So I'm just going to rein that back a little bit and set this slider to around 50. Underneath the radius slider, the blade curvature slider is used to round the edges of our shape, and the rotation slider rotates the shape, allowing you a lot of control over the effect of blur that you apply. But in this example we're going to be leaving both of these sliders to 0. Now all we need to do is click OK to apply the effect to our image, and as you can see our model has now become very blurred. But don't worry, like in the other two parts of this soft focus and diffusion video tutorials, we're going to be using the opacity slider in the layers palette just to rein back the amount of blur which is being applied to our model. And I'm just going to knock it back to an opacity of around 50%, and you can see that we've just brought some detail back into the model's eyes, nose and mouth, but we're still creating a nice soft focus effect on the skin tones. So now we need to add a layer mask to our blur layer, our background copy layer, and we can do that using this icon at the bottom of the layers palette, which is the add layer mask icon, and it's a grey square with a white circle. So just click on that and you can see that it's added a layer mask to our layer. Now we're going to paint black into our layer mask, which is going to have the effect of masking out areas of our blurred layer and bringing through some of the sharper detail from the layer beneath. So to paint black in the layer we need to make sure that we've got our foreground colour set to black. If yours isn't, just press D on the keyboard and that will revert your foreground swatch to black. Next go over to your toolbox and we want to select the paintbrush tool, and up in the options bar at the top of the screen we can configure our paintbrush. Now I want to select a 40 pixel soft edge brush, so I'll set the hardness to 0 and the pixel radius to 40. Hit OK on the keyboard, and I want to set my brush opacity to 100%. Now I'm going to zoom in tight, so I'm going to hold down Control on the keyboard and press the plus symbol on the keyboard, and then holding down the spacebar and using my left mouse button I can scroll around the image So I'm about 100% is fine. I release the spacebar and now I can paint into my layer mask. Now to do this you need to make sure that your layer mask is selected. You can see that bounding box around the white rectangle on my layer indicates that I'm painting black into the mask. I'm not painting black onto my image layer. And so you can just work around. Now what I want to do here is I just want to paint into the whites of the eyes and the pupils of the eyes. I don't want to select the eyelashes or eyebrows at the moment because we're going to paint into those using a lower opacity brush just to make them a little bit less in focus than the pupils and the whites of the eyes. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. And if you take a look at our layer mask on our blur layer, you can see that the areas that I've masked out have now been shown up with a couple of black dots. So now to recreate that shallow depth of field effect, I want to bring back some of the other features like the model's eyelashes and eyebrows, but with a lower opacity brush, so that they're a little bit less sharp than the principal area of focus, which is the eyes. So go back up to the options bar at the top and use the opacity slider, and I'm going to drop my brush opacity down to 75%. I'm also going to use a slightly larger brush, so using the right hand square bracket key on the keyboard, just hit that a couple of times and I'm going to select a 100 pixel brush, and you can see that I'm on 100 pixels. Again, up in the options bar the brush size changes as I hit the square bracket key. Right, before I start painting I'm just going to zoom out again, so again control on the keyboard, this time press the minus key, and now I'm just going to sweep my paintbrush around the model's eyelashes. I'll do both eyes, I'll do this one here as well, and also just to give a little bit of definition to the face I'm just going to sweep it over the cheek lines here and along the jawline. Up there. Okay. Next I'm going to lower my brush opacity down to 50%, and this time I'm going to paint over the model's lips and mouth, so they're going to be not quite as sharp as the model's eyelashes. And with that done, I'm just going to go up to the opacity slider again. I'm just going to drop it to 40%, and now I'm going to run it over the model's eyebrows. Okay, that's starting to come together. Next I'm going to drop the opacity again, so back up to the options bar, use the slider here. I'm just going to drop that to 30%, and use the square bracket key on the keyboard, just give myself a slightly larger brush, something around 500 pixels. It's looking good, and I'm just now going to sweep the brush over the model's fringe at the front here, just giving that a little bit more definition. Okay, there we go, that's really starting to come together, and we've got that shallow depth of field effect with the nose out of focus, the eyes pin sharp, and the other features slightly less sharp. And now you can see our layer mask up here in our layers palette. We've painted onto the mask, and you can see where we've painted. We've got jet black where we painted with 100% opacity over the eyes, and then the jawline, cheekbones, mouth and hair, using those lower opacity brushes, is just indicated by lighter shades of grey. Okay, so finally we can use the opacity slider again in the layers palette. So with our blurred layer or our background copy layer still highlighted, you can control the strength of the blur which is applied. So leave it at 50% for quite a subtle effect, or you can crank it all the way up to 100% for a much more blurred soft focus effect, or leave it somewhere in the middle if you like. I think let's have a look, effect of around 65% is working well on this image, just really smoothing out those skin tones, creating a nice soft focus lens effect. I really hope you've enjoyed this and all three parts of this month's Digital Darkroom video tutorials. Give them a go using the start images off the CD, and then you can experiment with lens blur, Gaussian blur and the diffuse glow filter on your own pictures in future. Okay, cheers.